Okay, well, I hope it's going to be a bit more wide-ranging than that, but I hope you'll find it interesting anyway. Thank you for your introduction, Julian, and very grateful to be here at the Institute for Government. I'd like to talk about how I think we have actually a serious opportunity, quite a historic opportunity, to build a set of national priorities for government. I'm going to talk about that during the course of this speech. But first, let me say something about the occasion that Julian referred to for us. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the NAO, in spirit if not in name, by the passing of the Exchequer and Audit Departments Act in 1866. And the Act established the position of Comptroller and Auditor General and the Exchequer and Audit Department. So in a way, it's the Comptroller and Auditor General's 150th birthday. This post was entrusted then as now with the responsibility for auditing the financial accounts produced by each government department and reporting the results to Parliament. Now, I am the 17th Comptroller and Auditor General, but still it hasn't protected me from comments by various members, a lot of members of my staff, and quite a few members of the PAC, to the effect that I'm looking relatively chipper for 150. And in addition to that, as I was preparing my speech, I've had quite a lot of advice on analogies I might draw about the office of Comptroller and Auditor General. A very small number of people thought that I might liken it to James Bond, renewed every 10 years. Very small number. Quite a lot of people thought that it probably was much geekier and had more to do with Doctor Who, and that perhaps somewhere in the basement of our extensive building in Queen Victoria Street might be a police box. That was probably the majority view. And then coming from senior positions in the civil service was what I will describe as a more vampiric view, suggesting that there might in fact be a coffin somewhere in the basement of the office where I withdrew at night before coming forth to do whatever it was to the public sector later in the day. So, however, in all of that time, the face of the Comptroller and Auditor General has changed, but the mission stays the same, and it's broadly the same one that William Gladstone had in mind when he created the role of Comptroller and Auditor General 150 years ago, to support Parliament and to support the backbenches of Parliament in holding the executive to account for how it deals with public money. And that is actually where I get my passionate commitment to this job, because I will never forget that public money means money belonging to the public. And for me, that has a reality. So while we can reflect, that's all the historic bit you're going to get, by the way, and while we reflect on that with a sense of achievement, I really want to focus on now and the future. And today I've published two reports, one on the 2015 spending review, which shows that there is no overarching strategic framework, despite very many good processes in the review, and on the progress with single departmental plans, which shows that the plans are a positive step, a very positive step, but not yet a credible framework for planning over a 3-year period. So there's quite a lot more to go if we're going to develop credible medium-term planning. And in the autumn this year, the NAO will publish a complementary report to answer the following question: does government have a coherent plan for closing the current capability gap? Based on my previous work in this area and the shape of the current evidence, I can be clear. First of all, there is a capability gap, and in some areas it's quite substantial. And the government does have a plan, but it's not comprehensive and is based on growing organically the resources and skills that are needed in the civil service. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it will take time to develop. Much of what I'll go on to say is contained in these reports in greater detail, and I'm very grateful for the NAO team who did the excellent work to develop these reports and brought these issues together. I'm also hugely supportive of the work that John Manzoni is doing in the Cabinet Office. A lot of what is in our reports are issues that John is actually addressing. His work to bring the single departmental plans together, to try and put standards around those plans, and to seek to ensure that in future over time we'll have the best people with the right skills throughout the civil service is all to be commended. It's all travelling in the right direction, and there have been significant advances in the last few years in terms of improvement of guidance for major projects and other areas of that sort. And I think that's important to say. But all of that is a fairly gradual process, and he wouldn't pretend himself that it's at the point of fruition in many of these areas. And I'm really focusing somewhat on where we are now and on some of the challenges that we face today. I want to start by talking about the importance of prioritization. We have a unique independent view across government. Possibly I should be doffing my hat to the Institute of Government there, but we have access to information across government. And I want to draw on this to talk to you about what it means to manage and prioritize such a huge array of government activities and projects, and to do it well. So the first thing I suggest is this: let's stop pretending that the civil service can deliver whatever ministers throw at it. The civil service is overcommitted. That's quite clear to me because of the skills gaps that there evidently are in a number of key areas, and their long-term skills gaps, and also clear from all the work we've done across our portfolio. It gives us ample evidence, and just in the recent past we see extensions in timescale and projected cost in HS2, universal credit, many other. All of this is a sign that there's pressure on the system and pressure on the ability to deliver, across the portfolio. The civil service needs to get permission to stop doing things that are not mission critical. To decide what to stop or delay, government must get much better at prioritizing its activities and projects. This means working out which initiatives use scarce resources but are only really nice to have, and deprioritizing those projects. At present, the government's portfolio of major projects is enormous. It includes central government's biggest and riskiest projects, and at September 2015 it had an estimated whole life value of £405 billion. And indeed, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority suggests that between 70 and 80% of these projects are quite new in nature. They are, many of them, described as transformation projects. What that means is they contain a large digital element, and they contain complex change processes, including cultural change. So these are not straightforward change processes. They are complex and challenging. And civil servants are being asked to deliver this at a time when Westminster departments have never had smaller workforces. As at December 2015, civil service headcount was down nearly 1/5 since 2010. With such a portfolio of major projects, we need to turn from a heroic go-for-it approach to really making our resources count and doing the things that matter the most. So why do we overcommit? Why is the civil service overcommitted? Well, first of all, because I think, frankly, ministerial terms are short, sometimes less than 5 years, and each minister wants to make his or her own mark. Imagine the oddity of a new minister standing up in the House to say, I have no policy initiatives to announce because my department is at capacity in terms of what it can do well. So I'm diligently carrying out the initiatives started by my predecessor in an effort to bring them in on time and on budget. Whilst my staff and I would be immensely refreshed, we might not have so much to do though, and so might the taxpayer be immensely refreshed by that approach. In our current political culture, it would meet with a forest of raised eyebrows. And this is coupled with the fact that, as I see it, civil servants find it very hard to tell ministers no, or that they cannot deliver on ministerial aspirations. This means that projects go ahead when departments don't have the resources, often managerial resources nowadays, to take them on. And often they go ahead without knowing what the private sector's capacity to support them may be. This can contribute to unrealistic expectations of what is achievable. And we need to ask ourselves, can the public sector deliver Hinkley Point C, a third runway, HS2, a northern powerhouse, nuclear decommissioning, Trident renewal and restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster, and many more, all at the same time? Many of these projects are drawing, in part at least, on the same pool of skills, and many of them contain optimism bias in the planning. We find that again and again in our work, which means that they'll probably take longer and cost more than was originally planned, and they probably require more resource. So one thing is clear: given the dynamics and the track record that I've outlined, departments are unlikely to reduce their commitments under their own steam. This needs to be part of a wider, overarching, cross-government approach. To date, the government's record of accomplishment is best characterised in pursuing major projects and programmes as we get there in the end, rather than right first time. In the last Parliament, when the NAO reported on improvements in the way aspects of projects in some departments were managed, we also reported regularly on project failures and on ongoing projects that are experiencing considerable difficulties. Not much has changed since then. And let's pause for a minute and consider that doing things well is much more complicated than it used to be. The activities of government are ever more interdependent and much more technical than in the past. And as I've said, 70 to 80% of major projects are transformational, and that effectively means substantially digital. Failure now does much more damage to public value, and the reason for that is so many initiatives are interconnected. To get such projects right, there are three main dependencies: skills, money, and time. When it comes to skills, today's civil service needs people who can carry out highly technical projects with large digital and behavioural change components. People with those skills, and by the way, people who can manage those sort of projects, people with those skills have a cost, and the government needs to ensure that there are enough such people in the marketplace and also in the government's commissioning function to carry the business off, and that the balance between them is right. And that's an important point. Just hiring everyone out of the marketplace doesn't get the job done. You have to have the home team able to challenge the work being done by the consultants. If you can't challenge them effectively, you're not in control of what is happening in your name. So I think there's a critical question there as to how you understand your approach. That's, of course, in addition to the project and portfolio management skills, which are also very much in demand and under pressure. And where there are capability gaps, the government needs to have a clear idea of what those gaps are. In 2015, we did some work to look at digital skills across government. CIOs across government agreed with us that the digital capability gap in people terms means that government needs to find about 2,800 staff with digital skills to undertake its digital projects over the next 5 years. 2,800. If government managed to deploy all of the digital specialists required as permanent civil servants, this would cost an extra 213 million per annum to fill the gap, and it would be roughly double that if they were hired off market. So obviously the real number would be somewhere between. When it comes to money, departments have been asked to do more with less whilst being handed smaller budgets at the centre. Some departments still appear to have big reform plans to transform the way they deliver and reduce their headcount. For example, in the last parliament spending review, BIS as was, and we have to say that now, had an administrative budget cut of 40%. So that is, as we sit there, what's sitting in the plan. Now, will all of that be reversed out? How is that all got to be dealt with? We need to ask ourselves, is it reasonable to plough on with such departmental reform plans, and how are they going to be changed? And finally, on time, I frequently see unrealistic timescales as optimism bias creeps into program planning. More often than not, I would say there is optimism bias on time. So let's think about prioritization. If we're overcommitted, we need to lighten the load, and that means stopping doing things. This can be done by not adding projects or by cancelling existing ones. Prioritizing is about making these choices intelligently. So we need to know how much scarce resource would be released by any particular decision and what consequences there would be from that decision elsewhere. Departments should routinely keep track of these priorities and recognize wider government needs when called on. So they shouldn't just be thinking about what they need. It's not for me to say what the government's priorities should be, but let me give an example to illustrate the web of high dependencies. And let's do that by taking an example of something that's completed, the project to provide real-time information at HMRC. If for some reason you decided to discontinue that project, you'd be disabling progress on PAYE, you'd be damaging universal credit, and many other activities throughout DWP and HMRC, things that are crucial to bringing in income into the country. So that would, on the face of it, be a low priority a very low priority choice. But let's suppose that the governments say that the potential replacement of the emergency services airwave network in the Home Office is a relatively freestanding project and able to wait for a few years. That would be an example of something which government might decide could be delayed. And there are other projects which have that relatively freestanding but quite high cost, and let us mention quite high risk aspect. And I think it is possible to make, I considered, could I say this to you without giving some examples, and I don't think it really works to try and do that, so that's why I have given a few. As I've said, I'm hugely supportive of what John Manzoni is doing, but the current collection of processes do not yet amount to a coherent framework for prioritising and managing public sector activity. And progress is too slow for the current dynamic environment in which we find ourselves. Improvement is slower than the growth and the challenges that the public sector faces. And today the situation is even more urgent because now we have Brexit. Having taken the decision, Brexit brings with it a completely new layer of unknowns and requirements. It will be a major upheaval for the public sector for years to come, and it can fairly be described, or on an understated basis, as an abnormal challenge. The government does recognise this, I think. I'm not trying to suggest that they haven't noticed it, but some of the machinery of government changes we see imply acknowledgement of the scale of the challenge. But we can already see the beginnings of existing activities being denuded of capability as civil servants are pulled away to Brexit-related activities. And it's not surprising. And we could find that we add to that a possible Scotsit. And by the way, I claim origination rights for that term. And let me tell you, it would be a negotiation you could see from the moon, if that were to happen, and would again require enormous public sector resource. Add that to our massive projects portfolio, and my experience of watching public sector at close quarters tells me the system could come to a halt under its own weight in unexpected places, not universally, but in unexpected places. We will have set civil servants a Herculean task and set them up to fail, and none of us can afford that. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not joining the clamour pointing to our lack of skills in trade negotiation. That's well established. My point goes further. If that were the only issue, we'd be relatively well placed. I'm calling for a step change in the way we manage the activities of government. Brexit means a lot of additional work for departments. Every department needs to take stock of its interactions with the EU, both transitionally during any leaving period and as to the gaps that may be left. Everything from EU science research funding, aviation policy, fisheries policy, almost everything that DEFRA does, competition regime. We are part of customs union with the EU, so creating a customs regime will need to be looked at and new systems and business operations put in place to fill the gap left by the EU. And the timescales may be relatively short. We just don't know that. Already we can see the EU being cut out of some the UK being cut out of some EU systems, science funding being one area where one has stumbled across examples already. So let's use this historic juncture to change the way we manage government and plan on a holistic basis so that ministers and civil servants can look across the whole of government activities and decide what is essential and what's not. That is crucial to preserving value for money. In conclusion, ministers need to recognise the depths of the challenge they face. Quite understandably, they want to drive reform, but that can mean acting as if your eyes are too big for your stomach. I realise it doesn't sound as if I have a lot of sympathy with ministers and their dilemma, but I really do. They came into politics in order to make a difference, and they want to do that. But we should not be running on a perpetual overload as a normal state in the public sector. So we need to be in control of and manage our commitments against our capacity to carry them out. And I really don't think the record shows that at the moment. We're going to have to prioritise Brexit in many cases across government, not just in the new Brexit department. Let's manage the change proactively across government rather than in a series of panic measures. There is the potential for a real mess if we don't get this gripped. And on the other hand, there is a historic opportunity to change how we do things on a permanent basis. Finally, on a lighter note, my last thought. As the latest avatar of the Comptroller and Auditor General, I will use the opportunity of my 150th birthday to say, at a time of such interesting and challenging events, I'm looking forward to the next 150 years.